Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime History. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. An empire that lasted over 600 years, that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the borders of Persia, from the plains of Hungary to the shores of North Africa, did not begin with a grand army, a wealthy king, or a powerful navy. It began with a single tribe of a few thousand people camped on the cold, dusty frontier of northwestern Anatolia, surviving between two crumbling worlds, with almost nothing to their name except horses, loyalty, and a stubborn refusal to stay small. That is the Ottoman Empire, and tonight we are going to follow its entire extraordinary journey from that forgotten camp in the hills to the courts of the most powerful sultans the world has ever known. Before we drift into the story, if you genuinely enjoy what gets put together here, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are right now and what time it is. It sounds like a small thing, but there are people all over the planet lying awake just like you, and knowing they found their way here too is actually rather wonderful. Now, settle in, adjust the pillow, let your shoulders drop. Tonight we are going back roughly 700 years to a world that looked almost nothing like ours, and we are going to watch something remarkable take its very first breath. To understand where the Ottomans came from, it helps to understand what the world looked like in the late 1200s. It was not a stable place. The Mongol armies of Genghis Khan and his successors had spent most of that century tearing through Central Asia and the Middle East like a storm that had no intention of stopping. In 1258, they sacked Baghdad, killing the Abbasid Caliph and effectively ending the golden age of the Islamic world in one brutal sweep. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had controlled most of Anatolia for 2 centuries, was by now a Mongol vassal still technically existing, but hollowed out, its authority reduced to ceremony. The Byzantine Empire, once the great power of the Eastern Mediterranean, had been weakened by the Crusades, fractured by its own civil wars, and was spending most of its energy simply trying not to collapse. Into this messy, unsettled space, this gap between falling powers, dozens of small Turkic groups had drifted westward from Central Asia over the preceding decades. They were semi-nomadic, mostly Muslim, experienced fighters and horsemen, and they were looking for land, grazing rights, and a future. History would remember most of them as the Anatolian beyliks, small principalities scattered across the peninsula, each carving out its own territory in the political vacuum left behind by the Mongols and the fading Seljuks. One of these groups was the Kai clan, part of the larger Oghuz Turkic people. Their leader, a man named Ertugrul, had been granted a small stretch of land near the town of Sogut in the northwestern corner of Anatolia, close to the Byzantine frontier. It was not particularly rich land. It was borderland, the kind of place where the rules were loose and survival required constant attention. But it also meant that Ertugrul's people were positioned right on the edge of Byzantine territory, which gave them something valuable: the opportunity to raid, to expand, and eventually to grow. When Ertugrul died, sometime around 1280, his son Osman inherited leadership of the clan. Osman was probably in his early 20s. History does not give us a physical description that can be verified, but later Ottoman tradition describes him as a practical, serious man, not especially interested in spectacle, very much interested in results. What is clear from his actions is that he had an unusually good instinct for politics. He understood that raw raiding was not enough. To build something lasting, you needed alliances, legitimacy, and a reason for people beyond your own tribe to follow you. He found part of that legitimacy through marriage. Osman married the daughter of a respected local religious figure, a sheikh named Edebali, whose spiritual authority gave Osman's ambitions a kind of moral weight in the eyes of the Muslim frontier communities around him. Ottoman legend would later frame this with a famous dream. Osman supposedly saw a great tree growing from his chest, its roots spreading across 3 continents, its branches providing shade for the whole world. Sheikh Edebali interpreted this as a prophecy of imperial destiny. Whether Osman actually had this dream is impossible to know, but the story itself mattered because it gave his project a narrative, and people, then as now, followed narratives. Through the 1280s and 1290s, Osman gradually expanded his territory. He raided Byzantine towns and villages along the frontier, not always violently in many cases. He absorbed local communities rather than simply destroying them. This is worth noting. Osman was not running a purely exclusionary enterprise. Christians who submitted to his authority and paid tribute were generally left alone. Some even joined his forces. The frontier world he was building was rough and competitive, but it was also, in a practical way, somewhat pluralistic, not out of idealism, but because absorbing people was simply more useful than alienating them. The conventional date given for the founding of the Ottoman state is 1299. This is partly symbolic, a tidy marker chosen by later historians. What actually happened was a gradual process of Osman asserting his independence from what remained of Seljuk authority, essentially declaring himself the sovereign ruler of his own domain. He was not yet calling himself a sultan. The formal titles would come later, but by the turn of the 14th century, the principality he controlled was no longer just a tribe with grazing land. It had its own small administrative structure, its own currency, and its own growing ambition. The moment that gave Osman's project genuine credibility came in 1301 at a place called Bafyas, near the city of Nicomedia, today's Izmit, in northwestern Turkey. A Byzantine force marched out to push back against Osman's growing raids, and Osman defeated them. It was not a massive engagement by the standards of later Ottoman warfare, but it was significant. Word spread. Other Turkic fighters from across Anatolia began drifting toward Osman's camp, drawn by the prospect of a leader who was winning. The Byzantine defeat at Bafyas accelerated exactly the kind of migration that would fuel Ottoman expansion for the next century. What made Osman's principality different from the other beyliks scattered across Anatolia was its location and its momentum. The other principalities were surrounded on all sides by Muslim rivals. Osman sat on the Byzantine frontier, which meant there was always somewhere new to push, and the Byzantines, stretched thin and politically distracted, struggled to mount a consistent response. Every victory brought more recruits. More recruits meant more territory. More territory meant more tribute and resources, which funded further expansion. The cycle, once it started, proved difficult to interrupt. Osman spent the last years of his life focusing on Bursa, a wealthy, well-fortified Byzantine city that he wanted to take. He never quite managed it himself. By the early 1320s, he was elderly and unwell, and the siege of Bursa was left to his son Orhan. Osman died around 1323 or 1324. His body was carried to Bursa after Orhan took the city, which he did, shortly after his father's death, and buried there. The tomb of Osman, rebuilt and restored many times over the centuries, remained a place of reverence for Ottomans throughout the life of the empire. Every new sultan would travel to Bursa after their accession to be symbolically girded with the sword of Osman in a ceremony that tied them to the founder and to the original claim. He had started with a patch of borderland and a few thousand followers. He left behind a growing state with a captured Byzantine city as its first real capital, a reputation for military competence, and a tradition of absorbing rather than simply destroying the communities around it. It was not yet an empire, but the bones of one were already there. The sons who built the machine. Orhan inherited a principality. What he left behind, roughly 36 years later, was something that could reasonably be called a state, and the difference between those two things is larger than it might sound. A principality is, in essence, a strong man and the people loyal to him. A state is something more durable. It has institutions, courts, treasuries, organized armies, administrative divisions, schools. It has a logic that outlasts any individual. When Osman died, The thing he had built depended almost entirely on the force of his own personality and reputation. When Orhan died, what he left behind could function without him. That transition, quiet and largely unglamorous, was one of the most important things to happen in Ottoman history. The first order of business was Bursa. Orhan's forces had been besieging it for some time before Osman's death, and it fell, depending on which source you trust, sometime around 1324 to 1326. It became the first true Ottoman capital, and Orhan set about making it feel like one. Mosques were built, a market was established. A theological school, a medrese, was founded in the nearby city of Iznik, which Orhan took in 1331. This was not simply piety. Attracting Islamic scholars and legal experts to the principality was a deliberate political move. It gave Ottoman rule a religious and intellectual legitimacy that went beyond military strength. Scholars wrote, they taught. They produced the kind of administrative and legal knowledge that running a functioning state actually required. The army was the other transformation Orhan oversaw. Under Osman, the Ottoman fighting force had been essentially a tribal levy men who fought because they were part of the clan, who brought their own horses and weapons, and who went home when the fighting was done. This worked fine for raiding. It was less reliable for holding territory. Orhan began moving toward a more professional model. He created a paid infantry force called the Yaya soldiers who trained regularly and could be deployed at will rather than assembled seasonally. It was a modest beginning compared to what would come later, but it reflected the same impulse that shaped everything Orhan did, turning informal arrangements into durable structures. Through the 1330s, Ottoman expansion continued at a steady pace. Nicomedia fell in 1337. The surrounding territory filled in around these captured cities, with local administrators appointed to collect taxes and maintain order. Orhan issued his own coinage, a small detail, but a meaningful one. A currency is a declaration. It says, this is a sovereign entity with its own economy and its own measure of value. The coins bore Orhan's name, and they circulated across an expanding territory as both practical instruments and quiet announcements of who was in charge. The relationship with Byzantium during these decades was complicated and, frankly, a little absurd in the way that only medieval dynastic politics can manage to be. The Byzantine Empire was not simply the Ottomans' enemy. It was also, at various moments, their employer, their in-law, and their reluctant landlord. The empire had been tearing itself apart with internal conflict for years, and two rival claimants to the Byzantine throne, John VI Cantacuzene and John V Palaiologos, each desperately needed outside military help to beat the other. Cantacuzene turned to Orhan. In exchange for Ottoman military support, he gave Orhan his daughter Theodora in marriage, sometime around 1346. Orhan did not convert. Theodora apparently did not fully convert either, though the details are blurry. The arrangement was political, and it worked at least for a while. Ottoman forces helped Cantacuzene secure his position, and Orhan gained not just a Byzantine bride but a close relationship with the empire that opened doors no raiding party could have forced. What Orhan was learning, and what his successors would master, was that military force and political maneuvering were most effective when used together. You did not always have to destroy something to control it. Sometimes you could simply make yourself indispensable to it. The crossing into Europe came in 1354, and it came almost by accident, or at least the opportunity arrived by accident, even if the decision to seize it was entirely deliberate. An earthquake struck the Gallipoli Peninsula on the northern shore of the Dardanelles Strait, damaging the walls of several Byzantine fortifications. Orhan's son Suleiman Pasha moved quickly. His forces crossed the narrow strait and occupied Gallipoli before the Byzantines could repair or reinforce it. It was the first permanent Ottoman presence on European soil, and its significance was immediately understood by everyone involved. The Byzantines were horrified. They pleaded for Gallipoli's return. Orhan declined, politely but firmly. From Gallipoli, Ottoman forces began moving inland into Thrace, the southeastern corner of the European continent. The territory was lightly defended. Byzantine authority there was nominal at best. Small settlements and fortifications fell one after another, and the Ottoman presence in Europe began to take root. Suleiman Pasha died in a horse-riding accident in 1359, which was an unfortunate end to a remarkably effective military career. But by then the foothold was established. There was no undoing it. Orhan died around 1360, or possibly 1362, the sources are not entirely in agreement, which is the kind of thing that happens when record-keeping is still being developed alongside the empire itself. He had reigned for roughly 3.5 decades. The territory under Ottoman control when he died was vastly larger than what he had inherited, and more importantly, it was organized. There were judges applying law. There were tax collectors filing accounts. There were schools producing trained administrators. There were soldiers who knew who they served and why. He had also left something less tangible but equally important, a model. The pattern Orhan established, absorb, administer, legitimize, expand, would be repeated by his successors with remarkable consistency. It was not a written doctrine. It was a habit, built up over decades of practical problem-solving, and it turned out to be extraordinarily effective. What also deserves a moment's attention is who lived in this expanding Ottoman world alongside the Turks, Byzantine Christians, Armenian merchants, Jewish communities displaced from elsewhere, and the various remnants of older Anatolian populations. These were not expelled or systematically persecuted during Orhan's reign. They paid taxes. They continued their own religious and community lives. They were subjects, not converts, which meant the Ottoman principality was from very early on a multi-faith enterprise, held together not by shared religion, but by shared submission to Ottoman authority. This would remain a defining feature of the empire, and a source of both its remarkable durability and its eventual internal tensions for centuries to come. The son who would follow Orhan into power was Murad, a serious and formidably capable man who would spend his own long reign turning the European foothold into a full-scale conquest. The Balkans, which had existed for centuries in the orbit of Byzantium and various Slavic kingdoms, were about to encounter something entirely new, and they would spend the next several hundred years trying to make sense of it. God's shadow on earth. When Murad I took power around 1360, he inherited an empire that sat awkwardly in two worlds. Its heartland was still in Anatolia, but its most exciting frontier was now in Europe. Orhan had planted the Ottoman flag at Gallipoli and watched his forces begin creeping into Thrace. Murad looked at that situation and made a decision that surprised almost everyone. He moved the center of gravity westward. Europe, he decided, was where the future was. The city that made this possible was Adrianople, a large, strategically positioned Byzantine city sitting in the heart of Thrace, at the junction of several rivers and trade routes. Ottoman forces took it somewhere around 1369, and Murad promptly made it the new Ottoman capital. The Byzantines still held Constantinople, of course that great walled city on the Bosphorus, but their surrounding territory was now Ottoman land, and their capital was effectively an island surrounded by an enemy state. The symbolic weight of that shift was not lost on anyone. The Ottomans had not just crossed into Europe. They had set up permanent residence there, declared it home, and started sending invitations. From Adrianople, which the Ottomans called Edirne Murad, pressed further into the Balkans. The political landscape of southeastern Europe in the 1360s and 70s was fractured and competitive. Bulgaria, Serbia, Macedonia, and various smaller principalities all had their own rivalries and ambitions, and none of them were strong enough individually to mount a coordinated resistance. In 1371, at the Battle of Maritsa, a combined Serbian and Bulgarian force marched against the Ottomans and was decisively defeated. The battle broke the military confidence of the Balkan states and opened Macedonia to Ottoman expansion. Over the following years, the territory filled in steadily, not always through conquest, but through a mixture of force, diplomatic pressure, and the pragmatic submission of local rulers who decided that cooperation with Murad was preferable to destruction by him. What Murad understood, and this is what separates him from many of his contemporaries, was that you could not hold a vast multi-ethnic empire together through fear alone. You needed systems. He invested heavily in the administrative infrastructure of the empire, extending the Timur system across his new European territories. Under this arrangement, cavalry soldiers called sipahi were granted the right to collect taxes from designated parcels of land in exchange for military service. It aligned the interests of the military class with the productivity of the territory they governed. Farmers had someone responsible for their land. Soldiers had an income tied to that land's stability. The system was imperfect, as all systems are, but it gave the empire a functional skeleton. The other institution Murad developed, and this one would echo through Ottoman history for centuries, was the Janissary Corps. The Janissaries were soldiers drawn through a process called the Devshirm, which translated roughly as the collection, every few years. Ottoman officials would travel through Christian villages in the Balkans and Anatolia, select boys between roughly 8 and 18 years old, healthy, intelligent, promising, and take them into state service. These boys were converted to Islam, given a thorough military and administrative education, and trained into some of the most formidable soldiers in the medieval world. They owed everything to the Sultan. They had no family inheritance to protect, no tribal loyalty to divide their attention, no local lord to serve. Their identity was the Ottoman state, which made them, in theory, perfectly loyal instruments of imperial will. In practice, the Janissaries would eventually become something considerably more complicated, but that story belongs to a later chapter. In Murad's time, they were a genuine military innovation. A professional, trained, disciplined standing army at the Sultan's direct command was something that very few rulers in the world possessed at that point. Most armies of the period were assembled for specific campaigns and dissolved afterward. The Janissaries were always there, always ready, and always improving. It gave the Ottomans a structural military advantage that their neighbours struggled to match. Murad also formalised the empire's relationship with Islamic law, appointing senior judges and religious scholars to positions of real authority within the administrative system. The title he carried Sultan came with increasingly elaborate religious framing. Later sultans would adopt the phrase God's shadow on earth, a phrase that captured the Ottoman understanding of imperial authority as something divinely sanctioned rather than purely political. Murad did not invent this idea, but his reign gave it institutional weight. His end came at Kosovo in 1389. A coalition of Balkan forces, Serbs, Bosnians, Albanians, and others, assembled under the Serbian Prince Lazar for what was essentially a last serious attempt to stop the Ottoman advance in Europe. The battle itself was an Ottoman victory, though a costly one. Prince Lazar was captured and killed. The Balkan coalition was broken, but Murad did not live to fully appreciate the outcome. He was killed that same day, according to most accounts, by a Serbian nobleman named Miloš Obilić, who managed to reach the Sultan in the aftermath of the fighting and stabbed him. The details are disputed and layered with Serbian epic tradition, but the death itself is not in question. Murad I died on the Kosovo field, victorious and murdered in the same afternoon. His son Bayezid took command immediately, killed his brother to eliminate any rival claim, and pushed forward. He would reign for 13 turbulent years, a story with a dramatic and humbling end, which belongs to the next section. But before moving past the era of the Murads, the second one deserves his place in the account. Murad II came to power in 1421, after a period of catastrophic instability that nearly ended the empire entirely. He was, in many ways, temperamentally similar to his great predecessor, steady, methodical, more interested in consolidation than spectacle. He restored Ottoman authority in Anatolia, fought off a Hungarian-led crusade at the Battle of Varna in 1444, and won a second decisive battle at Kosovo in 1448, completing what the first Murad had started nearly 60 years earlier. He was also one of the more culturally curious of the early sultans, genuinely interested in poetry, architecture, and the intellectual life of his court. He did something else that was almost unheard of for a ruling sultan. He abdicated voluntarily in 1444, handing power to his 12-year-old son Mehmed. The reasoning involved a mix of exhaustion, religious sentiment, and a genuine desire to step back. It did not work, largely because a new military crisis, the crusade at Varna, required experienced leadership, and his generals essentially refused to manage without him. He came back. Mehmed II would have to wait a little longer. When his father finally died in 1451, the young man who succeeded him would turn out to be rather exceptional, but that too is a story for another section. What the two Murads together represent is the empire in its institution-building phase. They were the rulers who turned Osman's instincts and Orhan's early structures into something durable enough to survive a catastrophe, reconstitute itself, and keep growing. The Janissaries, the Timur system, the Devshirm, the religious legitimacy, the administrative courts. These were not glamorous achievements in the way that a famous battle is glamorous, but they were the reason the Ottoman Empire lasted 600 years instead of 60. The lightning and the earthquake. Bayezid I moved fast. This was his reputation, his defining quality, and eventually his undoing. His soldiers called him Yildirim Lightning, and the nickname was earned. In the years following his father's death at Kosovo, he conducted military campaigns at a pace that left his enemies constantly scrambling to respond. He was in one place and then, seemingly without pause, somewhere else entirely. It was an impressive quality in a general. It was a more complicated quality in a sultan who needed to think carefully about which problems to solve and in what order. The early years of his reign gave him little reason for caution. He moved quickly to consolidate control over the Anatolian beyliks, the small Turkic principalities that had coexisted alongside the Ottomans since before Osman's time. Some of these had been absorbed peacefully. Others required force. By the mid-1390s, Bayezid had eliminated or subjugated most of them, bringing their territories and populations under direct Ottoman rule. On the European side, he continued pressing into the Balkans, tightening Ottoman control over Bulgaria and pushing toward the Danube. Then came the moment that seemed to confirm his status as the most formidable ruler in the region. In 1396, a massive European crusade assembled in response to Ottoman expansion, French knights, Hungarian cavalry, Wallachian forces, and contingents from across Christian Europe, led by Sigismund of Hungary. They marched toward the Danube with considerable confidence. The battle at Nicopolis, on the Bulgarian bank of the river, lasted a single day. Bayezid's forces broke the crusading army completely. Thousands of knights were captured. Sigismund barely escaped by boat. The crusade that was supposed to push the Ottomans back out of Europe ended as a rout, and Bayezid's reputation in both Europe and the Islamic world was elevated to something approaching legend. He was, at this point, arguably the most powerful ruler between the Rhine and the Euphrates. He had a professional army, a growing navy, the largest territory the Ottomans had yet controlled, and a run of military success that made his judgment seem infallible. Constantinople, that great Byzantine holdout surrounded entirely by Ottoman land, was under a tight blockade. Bayezid had even begun constructing a fortress Anadolu Hisara on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, squeezing the city's access to supplies and reinforcements. It seemed like only a matter of time before the last piece fell. The problem was approaching from the east, and Bayezid was not paying it sufficient attention. Timur, known to European history as Tamerlane, was one of those figures who appears in the historical record like a force of nature rather than a person. He had emerged from the region around Samarkand in Central Asia in the 1360s and spent the following decades building an empire through a combination of military genius and systematic, deliberate terror. He conquered Persia. He devastated the Golden Horde. He invaded northern India, sacked Delhi, and departed having killed so many people that contemporary accounts become almost too large to process. He was not a Mongol by direct descent, but he deliberately modelled himself on Genghis Khan's legacy and pursued conquest with a similar organisational ruthlessness. By the late 1390s, Timur's attention had turned westward toward Anatolia, and the friction with Bayezid had a specific, traceable cause. Several of the Anatolian Beylik rulers that Bayezid had deposed or subjugated had fled east and sought refuge with Timur. They were, from their perspective, legitimate rulers who had been unjustly dispossessed. Timur agreed, or found it politically useful to agree, and demanded that Bayezid restore their territories. Bayezid's response was, by most accounts, dismissive and contemptuous. The two rulers exchanged letters that grew progressively less diplomatic, which perhaps gave the scribes involved some anxious moments, given what happened next. Timur invaded Anatolia in 1400. He sacked Sivas, an important city in central Anatolia, with thoroughness and cruelty, killing its garrison and much of its population. Bayezid's response was hampered by the fact that he was still managing his siege of Constantinople and had to disengage, which cost him time and strategic momentum. He assembled his army and moved to meet Timur, and the two forces came together near Ankara in the summer of 1402. The Battle of Ankara on the 28th of July, 1402, was one of the largest military engagements of the medieval period. Bayezid had a substantial army, estimates vary, but both sides fielded forces numbering in the tens of thousands. The Janissaries were there, trained and disciplined as always. Bayezid's cavalry was experienced and battle-hardened. On paper, it was not an obviously unequal contest, but Timur had prepared more carefully than the battle's outcome might suggest. Several of the Anatolian contingents in Bayezid's army, soldiers from the former Beyliks that Bayezid had absorbed, had complicated loyalties. They had served their original rulers before those rulers were displaced. Timur, before the battle, had made contact with these contingents and effectively offered them a way out, defect, and their old rulers would be restored. During the fighting, significant portions of the Anatolian cavalry switched sides. The Janissaries held their position and fought with everything they had, but the battlefield geometry had fundamentally shifted beneath them. Bayezid was captured before the day was out. He was the first Ottoman Sultan in the empire's history to be taken alive by an enemy, and the last, as it turned out. Timur kept him as a prisoner and travelled with him as his campaign continued into western Anatolia. The story that Bayezid was used as a literal footstool by Timur, who would step onto the Sultan's back when mounting his horse, circulated widely in European accounts and became part of the standard telling of the episode. Most serious historians today treat it as embellishment, the kind of dramatic detail that attaches itself to humiliating events because it so perfectly captures the emotional reality of the humiliation, whether or not it happened in precisely that form. What is not embellishment is that Bayezid died in captivity in 1403 in a city called Akshahir, never having regained his freedom. Timur swept through western Anatolia, taking the port city of Smyrna from the Knights Hospitaller, which gave him an achievement the Ottomans themselves had not managed. Then, having reorganized the territory to his satisfaction, he did something the Ottomans had perhaps not fully anticipated. He left. Timur had no particular interest in permanently occupying Anatolia. He restored several of the deposed Beylik rulers, divided parts of the remaining Ottoman territory among Bayezid's sons as a way of ensuring continued fragmentation, and turned his attention elsewhere. He would die in 1405 while preparing an invasion of China, which suggests his ambitions had a somewhat unlimited quality. What he left behind in Anatolia was an empire without a head, with its territory partially dismembered, its military prestige shattered, and 4 of Bayezid's sons already measuring each other for potential graves. The Ottoman state was not destroyed, its institutions were intact enough, its population still substantial, its administrative network still functioning in many places, but it had been struck a blow that would have finished a less deeply rooted entity entirely. Whether it could put itself back together was a question that would take the better part of a decade to answer. The decade the empire almost died. The sons of Bayezid had been watching each other for years before the fighting started. This was not unusual in Ottoman succession. The empire had no formal rule about which son inherited, no tradition of primogeniture, no legal mechanism for orderly transfer of power. What existed instead was a brutal and entirely predictable competition in which the surviving son became sultan and the others became cautionary examples. Fratricide was not considered monstrous within this system. It was considered prudent. A defeated prince left alive was a future rebellion waiting for a convenient moment. What made the situation after Ankara different was that Timur had scrambled the board before leaving. Rather than one central authority determining who would rule what, there were now 4 princes, Suleiman, Isa, Mehmed, and Musa, each holding a piece of the fragmented empire, each with his own army, and none of them willing to accept a secondary position. The result was 11 years of civil war that the Ottoman state was lucky, in the end, to survive. Suleiman held what was arguably the most valuable piece. He controlled the European territories, Rumelia, as it was called, ruling from Edirne, the very city his grandfather, Murad I, had made the Ottoman capital. The European provinces were more organized, more productive, and militarily more coherent than the Anatolian fragments. Suleiman had also managed to negotiate favorable terms with the Byzantine emperor and had the support of Serbian and Bulgarian vassal rulers. He was, on paper, the strongest of the brothers. Mehmed controlled a portion of central and northern Anatolia, based around the city of Amasya. He was younger than Suleiman, and initially less powerful, but he had something that would prove more durable than any of his immediate advantages: patience. He did not rush. He did not overcommit. He eliminated Isa, the weakest of the brothers, first, bringing Isa's Anatolian territory under his own control without triggering a full confrontation with Suleiman before he was ready. Musa, meanwhile, had a complicated beginning. He had been taken as a kind of hostage or trophy by Timur after Ankara, accompanying the conqueror's entourage during his sweep through Anatolia. After Timur's departure, Musa managed to extract himself from captivity and eventually made his way to the Balkans, where he positioned himself as an alternative to Suleiman in the European territories. He cultivated alliances with Wallachian and Bulgarian rulers who had their own grievances against Suleiman's governance, and in 1411 he defeated and killed his brother in a confrontation near Edirne. Suleiman, whose reign had given him a taste for comfort and negotiation rather than active campaigning, was apparently not prepared for how quickly things moved against him. He was caught and killed before he could mount an effective response. This left 2 brothers, Mehmed in Anatolia, Musa in Europe. The final contest played out over 2 years, with the Byzantine Empire playing a quietly significant role. Emperor Manuel II had spent the Interregnum trying to keep all of the brothers in a state of mutual competition, a sensible strategy for a weak power surrounded by stronger ones. Constantinople itself was not strong enough to defeat any of the brothers militarily, but it was extremely useful as a diplomatic actor, a source of naval transport, and a provider of legitimacy. Manuel eventually threw his support behind Mehmed, providing ships to carry Mehmed's forces across the Bosphorus into Europe in 1413. Musa was defeated near Sofia in the summer of that year. The manner of his death varies by source, but the outcome is consistent. Mehmed had him killed, and the Interregnum was over. The man who emerged from this decade of civil war was not the obvious candidate anyone would have predicted at the start of it. Mehmed I was not the eldest son. He was not the wealthiest or the most powerful at the outset. He had survived through a combination of geographic fortune, careful alliance building, and a temperamental steadiness that kept him from making the kind of catastrophic overcommitment that finished his brothers one by one. History has not always given him the attention he deserves, possibly because his reign from 1413 to 1421 was defined by consolidation rather than conquest, and consolidation does not produce the kind of dramatic narrative that draws chroniclers. What Mehmed I actually did was remarkable under the circumstances. He reassembled the administrative structure of the empire, reappointed judges and governors, restored the Timur land system in Anatolia, and re-established the relationships with Balkan vassal rulers that the chaos of the Interregnum had disrupted. He dealt firmly but without excessive brutality with the regional powers that had taken advantage of the civil war to assert their own independence. The Anatolian beyliks that Timur had restored presented a particular challenge. Some of them now had to be reabsorbed, which required a mix of diplomacy and force. Mehmed managed it carefully, avoiding full-scale military campaigns where possible, and accepting nominal submissions that could be formalized more completely later. The most serious internal challenge of his reign came not from a rival prince or a foreign power, but from a religious movement. Sheikh Bedreddin was a scholar and mystic who had, during the chaos of the Interregnum, developed a following around ideas that blended Sufi Islamic mysticism with social egalitarianism, the notion that distinctions of religion and property were less important than shared human community. In the context of the Ottoman world, these ideas found an audience among people who had been economically displaced by the civil war, and among non-Muslim communities looking for a framework that gave them genuine equality rather than merely tolerated status. Bedreddin's movement produced an armed uprising in 1416, centered in Thrace, that required a full military response to suppress. Bedreddin was captured and executed, his movement dispersed. But the episode was a reminder that the empire's recovery from the Interregnum was not simply a matter of administrative restoration. There were genuine social pressures building beneath the surface. One curious detail about the Interregnum that tends to get overlooked is how the Ottoman institutional structures survived it at all. The janissaries, the religious courts, the tax collection apparatus, the Timur holding Sipahi cavalry, all of these continued functioning to varying degrees throughout the civil war, attaching themselves to whichever prince controlled their particular region. The empire nearly collapsed at the political level, but its working parts kept working. This was, in a quiet way, the most important proof that Murad I and Orhan's institution building had actually succeeded. A state that survives a decade of civil war and emerges with its administrative skeleton largely intact is a state built on something more solid than the personality of its leader. Mehmed I died in 1421, apparently of a stroke, at roughly 36 years of age. He had spent 8 years putting back together something that should have been impossible to reassemble. His son Murad II, the same Murad discussed briefly in the previous section, inherited a functioning empire. Not a great empire, not yet fully recovered in all its parts, but a working one. The machinery was running, the borders were roughly restored, the janissaries were trained and paid. The question of what to do next could now, for the first time in over a decade, be approached as a strategic problem rather than a survival problem. The boy who dreamed of Rome. Mehmed II came to his permanent reign in 1451, at 19 years of age, and within months of taking power, he began making preparations for something his predecessors had circled for nearly a century without completing: Constantinople, the city, the walls, the idea. He had grown up thinking about it. This is not a romantic embellishment, it is simply documented fact. Mehmed was an unusually well-educated young man for his time and position. He spoke several languages, including Greek and Latin, and had read widely in the classical tradition. He knew the history of Rome, knew Alexander the Great's campaigns, knew what Constantinople represented not just as a military target but as a symbol. Whoever held that city held a claim, however tenuous, however contested, to the legacy of the Roman Empire itself. Mehmed wanted that claim. He had wanted it since he was old enough to understand what it meant. His early years had not been entirely smooth. When Murad II abdicated briefly in 1444, the 12-year-old Mehmed was placed on the throne as his successor, an experiment that went poorly almost immediately. The Janissary Corps, accustomed to experienced leadership, grew restless. A Hungarian-led crusade threatened the European territories. The Grand Vizier effectively managed the actual governance, while the young Sultan struggled with the weight of a position he was not yet ready for. Murad came back. Mehmed was returned to the role of prince and heir, and spent the remaining years of his father's reign governing the province of Manisa in western Anatolia, reading, planning, and waiting. When Murad died in 1451 and Mehmed took permanent control, he moved with a speed and clarity of purpose that caught even experienced Ottoman courtiers off guard. The first order of business was Constantinople itself, and the preparations he made were thorough in a way that previous Ottoman attempts on the city had not been. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople were the problem that had defeated every attacker for over 1,000 years. Built in the early 5th century and repaired repeatedly since, they were a triple-layered system of moat, outer wall, and inner wall stretching across the narrow neck of land connecting Constantinople to the European mainland. No army, regardless of its size, had ever successfully breached them. The Byzantines had survived Avar sieges, Arab sieges, Bulgarian sieges, and 2 earlier Ottoman blockades, largely because of those walls. Mehmed understood that taking Constantinople meant solving the walls, and solving the walls meant artillery on a scale that had never been deployed in a siege before. This is where a Hungarian engineer named Urban enters the story. Urban had approached the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI with an offer to build him the largest cannon the world had seen. The emperor was interested, but unable to pay. Urban then walked across to the Ottoman side, a journey of some philosophical brevity, and made the same offer to Mehmed, who paid him generously, gave him all the materials and workers he needed, and asked for the cannon as large as Urban could possibly make it. The result was a bronze barrel roughly 27 feet long, capable of firing stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. It took 60 oxen and 400 men to move it into position. It could fire about 7 times a day, which sounds modest until you consider what happened to the things it was pointed at. Mehmed also constructed a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus Rumeli Hisare directly across from the earlier Anadolu Hisare on the Asian side. Together, the 2 fortresses effectively cut Constantinople off from naval resupply from the Black Sea. The city was being strangled before the siege officially began. The formal siege started in the first week of April, 1453. The Ottoman army surrounding Constantinople was massive. Estimates range widely, but most modern historians suggest somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 men, against a Byzantine garrison of perhaps 7,000 defenders, including some Genoese and Venetian volunteers. The disparity was stark, but the walls had always made disparity irrelevant. What had changed was the artillery. Urban's great cannon and a battery of smaller guns alongside it began systematically reducing sections of the Theodosian walls. Progress was slow, and the defenders worked through the nights, filling breaches with earth, timber, and whatever materials were available. The Ottoman fleet in the Bosphorus was supposed to force the Golden Horn, the inlet, forming the city's northern harbour, but the Byzantines had strung a massive iron chain across its entrance, and the fleet could not break through. Mehmed's response to the chain was one of the most discussed logistical feats of the medieval period. He had his ships hauled out of the water, placed on wooden cradles greased with animal fat, and dragged overland across the hill behind the Genoese colony of Galata, then relaunched into the Golden Horn behind the chain. Whether this took one day or several is debated. That it happened is not. The Byzantines woke to find Ottoman warships in their harbour, and the psychological impact was as significant as the military reality. The final assault came in the pre-dawn hours of the 29th of May, 1453. Mehmed sent wave after wave against the wall's irregular forces first, then Anatolian troops, and finally the Janissaries, disciplined and fresh, targeting a section of wall that had been partially breached near a gate called the Kirkoporta. The Janissaries found their way through. Once Ottoman soldiers were inside the walls, the defence could not hold. Emperor Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, reportedly threw off his imperial insignia and died fighting in the streets. His body was never definitively identified, a detail that became the seed of later Greek legends about a sleeping emperor who would one day return. Mehmed entered the city that afternoon. He rode to the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had been the spiritual centre of Eastern Christianity for nearly 1,000 years, and stood inside it quietly. What he thought in that moment is not recorded with any certainty, but later Ottoman accounts preserved a fragment of Persian verse attributed to him, about spiders spinning webs in the palaces of kings and owls calling from the towers of the proud. Whether he actually said it, or whether it was attached to him later as a piece of fitting poetry, it captured something real about the mood of the moment, the strangeness of standing in an achievement that had been a dream for so long. He ordered the cathedral converted into a mosque. He also ordered, pointedly, that the city not be destroyed. Constantinople, which he would rename Istanbul, though the old name persisted in common use for centuries, was to be repopulated, rebuilt, and made into the capital of the Ottoman Empire. He invited Greek, Armenian, Jewish, and other communities to settle there. He appointed a new Greek Orthodox patriarch, signalling that the religious life of the city's Christian population would continue under Ottoman governance. Within weeks, Mehmed had adopted a title that announced his intentions to the world, Caesari Rum, Caesar of Rome. He was not merely the Ottoman Sultan. He was, in his own telling and that of his court, the heir to a tradition reaching back to Augustus. Whether the courts of Europe agreed was a separate matter, but the world had unquestionably changed on that May morning, and everyone who was paying attention knew it. The Sultan at the centre of everything. The morning after Constantinople fell, Mehmed had a city and a problem. The city was half empty. Years of Ottoman blockade, Byzantine decline, and the siege itself had reduced its population to a fraction of what it had been in its imperial heyday. The great avenues were overgrown. Entire neighbourhoods had been abandoned for decades. The infrastructure, water systems, markets, harbour facilities was in various states of decay. Mehmed had won the most symbolically significant city in the medieval world, and what he had won, in practical terms, was a very large ruin with excellent walls. He set about fixing this with characteristic decisiveness. Repopulation was the first priority. He issued broad invitations and, in some cases, direct orders to communities across the empire and beyond to settle in the new capital. Greek families, Armenian traders, Jewish merchants displaced from various parts of Europe, Turkic settlers from Anatolia, all were directed toward Constantinople and given incentives to establish themselves there. The city the Ottomans called Istanbul began filling in within years. By the time of Mehmed's death, it was once again a functioning metropolis, its markets busy, its harbour active, its population ethnically and religiously layered in a way that would define it for centuries. The physical transformation was equally ambitious. Mehmed commissioned a palace on the third hill of the city, what became the Old Palace, and later, in the 1460s, began construction of the Topkapi Palace on the peninsula overlooking the confluence of the Golden Horn, the Bosphorus, and the Sea of Marmara. Topkapi was not conceived as a single grand building in the European palatial style, but as a complex of courtyards, pavilions, administrative halls, and gardens, a small city within the city, organised around the idea of progressive access, where each inner court was more restricted than the last, and the Sultan himself existed at the administrative and physical center of concentric rings of authority. The Grand Bazaar, begun shortly after the conquest, gave the city its commercial heart, a covered market that grew over time into one of the largest trading spaces in the world. The administrative changes Mehmed implemented after the conquest were as significant as the physical ones. He developed a comprehensive legal code, the Kanun name, that systematized Ottoman law in ways that went beyond what Islamic religious law alone covered. Sultanic law and religious law existed in parallel within the Ottoman system, a distinction that would sometimes create tension but also gave the empire a flexibility in governance that purely theocratic systems lacked. Courts applied different bodies of law depending on the nature of the case, and judges trained in both traditions operated throughout the empire. The millet system, the framework for governing non-Muslim communities, was formalized under Mehmed in ways that gave it lasting institutional shape. Each major religious community was granted a degree of internal autonomy, governed by its own religious leadership under the ultimate authority of the Sultan. Mehmed appointed Gennadios Scholarios as the new Greek Orthodox Patriarch almost immediately after the conquest, a gesture that was both politically strategic and practically necessary. The Patriarch was responsible for the Greek Orthodox community's internal affairs, family law, religious practice, community disputes, and answered to the Sultan as his community's representative. A similar structure applied to the Armenian apostolic community and to Jewish communities throughout the empire. People were not required to convert. They were required to pay their taxes and acknowledge Ottoman sovereignty. What they did within those parameters was largely their own business. This was not equality in any modern sense, and it should not be romanticized as such. Non-Muslim communities paid additional taxes, faced restrictions on certain professions and public expressions of their faith, and operated within a hierarchy that placed Muslims, and particularly Ottoman Turks, at the top. But in the context of a 15th century world, in which religious minorities in much of Europe faced expulsion, forced conversion, or worse, the Ottoman millet framework offered a kind of structured coexistence that proved durable enough to last for centuries. Mehmed's military ambitions did not pause while he rebuilt his capital. The years between 1453 and his death in 1481 were almost continuously active. Serbia was fully conquered in 1459. The Morea, the last surviving Byzantine despotate in Greece, fell in 1460, and Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, the last remnant of the old Byzantine world outside Constantinople itself, was absorbed in 1461. Bosnia was taken in 1463. The Crimean Khanate became an Ottoman vassal in 1475, giving the empire control over the northern Black Sea coast and access to a powerful cavalry ally. The war with Venice, which ran from 1463 to 1479, was the most prolonged and complex conflict of Mehmed's later reign. Venice held a network of ports and islands throughout the eastern Mediterranean, Negroponte, Modon, Coron, and others that gave it commercial and naval influence in waters the Ottomans increasingly considered their own. The war was fought on multiple fronts across 16 years and ended with an Ottoman victory that cost Venice most of its eastern Mediterranean footholds and established the empire as the dominant naval power in the region. Mehmed's character during these years was more complex than the title conqueror suggests. He was genuinely, verifiably, intellectually curious in ways that were unusual for any ruler of his time. He spoke 6 languages. He had Ptolemy's geography translated and used it to commission a new map of the world. He collected Greek manuscripts. He invited the Venetian painter Gentile Bellini to his court in 1479 and sat for a portrait, an act that was, for a Muslim ruler, theologically unconventional enough to raise eyebrows among the more conservative elements of his court, who presumably said nothing out loud about it. The portrait survives and shows a man of middle age with a sharp, evaluating gaze, his nose prominent beneath a large white turban, looking like someone who is deciding something. He also, during a campaign in western Anatolia, made a detour to visit the site of ancient Troy to stand where Achilles and Hector had supposedly fought, and to reflect on the fact that he had now avenged the Trojans by conquering the Greeks. This was not an impulsive eccentricity. It was a calculated piece of historical self-positioning, and it tells you something about the way Mehmed understood his own place in the long arc of civilization. His final campaign was the most audacious. In 1480, an Ottoman force landed at Otranto on the heel of the Italian boot, captured the city, and appeared to be preparing for a march northward. Rome began making contingency plans for evacuation, which must have been an unsettling exercise for a city that had not faced a serious military threat since the Vandals in the 5th century. Mehmed died in May of 1481, before the Italian campaign could develop further, and the Otranto garrison withdrew shortly after. Whether he would actually have marched on Rome is a question history was not given the opportunity to answer. The possibility alone had been enough to make the papacy genuinely nervous, which says something about how seriously the world had come to take him. He died at 49, possibly of gout, possibly of something more deliberate. His physician, reportedly connected to interests loyal to Mehmed's son and successor Bayezid, has been suggested as an agent of the cause. Nothing was ever proven. Bayezid II, the more cautious and scholarly of Mehmed's two sons, secured the throne after a brief confrontation with his brother Jem, who eventually ended up as a refugee at the court of the Pope, where he served as a convenient diplomatic hostage for years. The man who lay in the tomb at the Fatih Mosque complex in Istanbul had remade a city, reorganized an empire, and permanently altered the map of the known world. Whether he had dreamed of Rome from boyhood or constructed that narrative afterward, the result was the same estate that now sat, undeniably, at the center of everything. The magnificent century. Between Mehmed II and Suleiman I, two sultans reigned, and the second of those two deserves more than a passing mention, because without him, Suleiman would have inherited a very different empire. Bayezid II ruled from 1481 to 1512, cautiously and without particular drama. He was a learned man, genuinely pious, more interested in consolidation than expansion. He did manage one significant act of humanitarian consequence. When Spain expelled its Jewish population in 1492, Bayezid dispatched the Ottoman fleet to bring them to Ottoman territory, reportedly remarking that the Spanish king had impoverished his own country while enriching the Ottoman one. Whether or not he said it in exactly those words, the policy itself was real, and tens of thousands of Sephardic Jews settled across the empire in Istanbul, Thessaloniki, and elsewhere, bringing skills, languages, and commercial networks that proved genuinely valuable. His son Selim I removed him from power in 1512 gently, by Ottoman standards, meaning Bayezid abdicated rather than being killed, though he died shortly after, possibly assisted toward that end. Selim earned the Turkish epithet Yavuz, meaning stern or formidable, and European sources settled on the grim, which gives a fair sense of his general disposition. He had his brothers and nephews killed to eliminate succession disputes, turned east with his full military attention, and spent 8 years doing something that no Ottoman sultan had managed in the same span of time. He roughly doubled the size of the empire. The Battle of Chaldiran in 1514 was the pivot point. The Safavid dynasty of Persia, led by Shah Ismail, had been aggressively pushing a Shia Islamic identity across the region and actively encouraging Shia sentiment among Anatolian populations, which Selim considered both a religious and a security threat. He marched east and met Ismail's cavalry with Ottoman artillery in a battle that the Safavids, who had not yet developed comparable gunpowder technology, were not equipped to win. Calderon settled, at least temporarily, the eastern frontier and established the rough boundary between the Ottoman and Safavid worlds that would be contested for the next 2 centuries. Then Selim turned south. The Mamluk Sultanate controlled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and by 1516 it was struggling. Two campaigns in 1516 and 1517 dismantled Mamluk power entirely. Egypt, the wealthiest province in the Arab world and the breadbasket of the Eastern Mediterranean, became Ottoman. With it came the Caliphate, the symbolic leadership of Sunni Islam, transferred to the Ottoman Sultan, giving the empire a religious authority it had not previously held in quite such explicit form. Selim died in 1520, at perhaps 50 years of age, before he could determine what to do next. He left his son an empire that was larger, richer, and more religiously authoritative than anything any previous Ottoman sultan had commanded. That son was Suleiman. He was 26 years old. He would reign for 46 years, and by the time he died, the Ottoman Empire would be the most powerful state in the world. Europeans called him magnificent. His own people called him Kanuni the lawgiver. Both titles were accurate, though they described different aspects of the same man. The military record of Suleiman's early reign was relentless. Belgrade fell in 1521, opening the door to Hungary. At Mohacs in 1526, Suleiman's forces met the Hungarian army of King Louis II in a battle that lasted roughly 2 hours and effectively ended the Kingdom of Hungary as an independent entity. Louis himself died unhorsed and drowned in a marsh while fleeing the field, which was an undignified end for a king who had ridden out that morning with every expectation of victory. Suleiman absorbed most of Hungary and made the rest a contested buffer zone between Ottoman and Habsburg power. In 1529, he marched to Vienna itself. The siege that followed was the closest the Ottomans ever came to the heart of Western Europe, and it failed, though not for the reasons that triumphalist European histories sometimes suggest. The Ottoman army was simply overextended. The supply lines from Istanbul to Vienna stretched an impractical distance. The campaigning season was shorter than anticipated. The city's defences held long enough that the onset of autumn made continuing the siege untenable, and Suleiman withdrew in good order. He was not defeated in the field. He was defeated by logistics and the calendar, two enemies that no amount of military genius entirely overcomes at the edge of a continent. The alliance he formed with France during this period caused something close to collective European disbelief. Francis I of France, a Christian king in perpetual conflict with the Habsburg Emperor Charles V, entered into a formal diplomatic and commercial relationship with the Ottoman Sultan. The Pope wrote letters of protest. The rest of Europe expressed varying degrees of horror. Suleiman and Francis, for their part, appeared entirely unbothered by the scandal their partnership generated, and the Franco-Ottoman alliance produced decades of coordinated pressure on the Habsburgs from east and west simultaneously. Practical politics, in Suleiman's experience, tended to be more useful than theological consistency. At sea, Suleiman gave command of the Ottoman fleet to a man named Hayreddin Barbarossa, a corsair of remarkable ability who had built an independent naval empire across the North African coast before placing it under Ottoman authority. Under Barbarossa, the Ottoman navy became the dominant force in the Mediterranean. The Battle of Preveza in 1538, fought off the Greek coast against a combined Christian fleet, established Ottoman naval supremacy and made the Mediterranean effectively an Ottoman lake for several decades. The legal reforms that gave Suleiman his Ottoman title were less dramatic than his military campaigns, but arguably more lasting in their effects. He systematized Ottoman civil and criminal law, filling in areas where religious law was silent or ambiguous, and created a comprehensive legal code that applied consistently across the empire's diverse territories. It was not a revolutionary reimagining of the legal system, it was meticulous, practical, careful work, the kind that does not make for exciting reading but that holds a complex society together across centuries. His personal life in the palace was its own kind of political theatre. His closest friend from childhood, Ibrahim Pasha, served as Grand Vizier from 1523, an extraordinarily powerful position that Ibrahim filled with genuine competence and increasing confidence. The confidence eventually became a problem. Ibrahim began making statements and gestures that implied a co-equal relationship with the Sultan, which was not a sustainable position for anyone around Suleiman to occupy for long. In 1536, Suleiman invited Ibrahim to dine with him at Topkapi Palace. Ibrahim accepted, spent the evening in apparently comfortable conversation, and was strangled in his sleep that night on Suleiman's orders. The friendship had lasted over 20 years. The decision to end it took, apparently, one dinner. His relationship with Hürrem Sultan, a woman from Ruthenia or possibly Poland who had entered the harem as a slave and risen to become Suleiman's legal wife, an almost unprecedented development, shaped the court politics of his later reign in ways that historians are still debating. Hürrem was by all accounts highly intelligent, deeply influential, and not particularly forgiving of threats to her son's succession prospects. When Suleiman's eldest son Mustafa, widely regarded as the most capable of his children and beloved by the Janissaries, was executed in 1553 on suspicion of plotting against his father, many contemporaries placed the source of that suspicion at Hürrem's feet. Whether the accusation was fair is not provable. What is clear is that Mustafa was killed, the Janissaries mourned him openly, and Suleiman spent his final years in a court shadowed by that decision. He died in 1566, at the siege of Szigetvár in Hungary, on the night before the city fell. He was in his early 70s, his health long failing, and his doctors concealed his death for weeks to prevent a collapse of morale in the field. The empire he had built was the largest it would ever be, stretching from Algeria to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimea to the Sudan. Its treasury was full. Its navy commanded the Mediterranean. Its law was sophisticated and its administration efficient. No ruler before or since would preside over the Ottomans at quite this height. Life inside the empire. To understand what the Ottoman Empire actually was, it helps to step back from the battlefield for a moment and ask a simpler question. What was it like to live there? At its height in the 16th century, the era of Suleiman, when the empire stretched across 3 continents and governed somewhere between 15 and 25 million people, the Ottoman world was not a single, uniform experience. It was an enormous collection of very different lives, lived under a shared administrative canopy that was more coherent in its paperwork than in its daily human reality. A wheat farmer in Bulgaria, a Jewish merchant in Thessaloniki, a Janissary officer in Istanbul, and a Bedouin shepherd in Syria were all, technically, Ottoman subjects. What that meant for each of them on an ordinary Tuesday was almost entirely different. The empire's social structure was divided along 2 fundamental lines. On one side sat the askari, literally the military class, though the term covered everyone who served the state and was exempt from taxation. This included soldiers, obviously, but also judges, teachers, palace officials, and the religious establishment known as the ulema. These were people whose income came from the state rather than from their own productive labour, and who answered to the Sultan's authority in a direct and formal sense. On the other side sat the riaya, the flock, as the Ottoman term translated, which meant everyone else: farmers, merchants, craftsmen, artisans. These were the taxpayers, the productive mass of the population whose surplus sustained the entire apparatus above them. Within the raya, a further distinction ran between Muslim subjects and the dimmest the protected non-Muslim communities, primarily Christians and Jews, who lived under the millet system discussed in an earlier chapter. In practical daily terms, the difference showed up in taxes, in the kinds of buildings communities were permitted to construct, in what colours certain groups were expected to wear in public, and in legal matters, where religious courts handled internal community affairs according to each group's own traditions. Non-Muslims could not, as a general rule, ride horses or carry weapons in the city. They paid the jizya, a head tax that acknowledged their protected but secondary status. In return, they received a degree of communal autonomy that was, by the standards of the 15th and 16th centuries, relatively rare in the world. Clothing in Ottoman society was not merely a matter of personal preference. It was a system of visual information that announced, at a glance, who you were, what community you belonged to, and roughly where you sat in the hierarchy. Muslim men of standing wore turbans, the colour, size, and wrapping style communicating rank and religious position. Ulama wore particular styles. Janissaries had their distinctive white felt Burke caps, tall and somewhat impractical looking, which had the practical advantage of making them immediately identifiable on a battlefield. Christian subjects in many parts of the empire were expected to wear dark-coloured outer garments and avoid colours associated with Muslim identity. Jewish communities were similarly distinguished in Istanbul during the 16th century. Blue was associated with Jewish dress in certain contexts. These rules were enforced inconsistently and flouted regularly, especially as the empire's cities grew more cosmopolitan, but they remained on the books and were occasionally enforced with renewed enthusiasm whenever a particular official decided to make the point. At the very top of the clothing hierarchy sat the Sultan and his court. The kaftans, worn by senior officials and the Sultan himself, were extraordinary objects, layered silk garments with intricate woven patterns, trimmed with fur, embroidered with gold and silver thread, and colour-coded to indicate the wearer's specific rank within the palace hierarchy. The imperial wardrobe was maintained with the same bureaucratic precision as the treasury. A garment worn by the Sultan on a specific occasion would be carefully catalogued, stored, and sometimes presented as a gift, a kaftan from the Sultan's own shoulders being one of the highest honours he could bestow. Several hundred of these garments survive in the Topkapi Palace collections today and remain among the finest textile objects from the period anywhere in the world. Food followed a similar logic of hierarchy. For ordinary people in both urban and rural settings, the daily diet centred on bread, lentils, chickpeas, and whatever vegetables the season provided. Lamb was the meat of preference across the empire, beef less common, pork absent from Muslim and Jewish tables. In the cities, kebabs of various kinds were a standard street food, along with burek pastry filled with cheese, spinach, or minced meat and various rice dishes that the Ottomans had inherited and elaborated from Persian and Arab culinary traditions. Sweets were a distinct category of Ottoman cultural pride. Baklava in its many regional variations, helva made from sesame paste or semolina, and a chewy confection made from sugar and starch that would eventually reach European markets under the name Turkish delight. Sherbet sweetened water flavoured with fruit, flowers, or spices was the drink of social occasions. And then there was coffee. It arrived in Istanbul around 1555, having come north from Yemen through Cairo, and it immediately became one of the most disruptive social developments in the empire's domestic history. Coffee houses kahvehan opened across the city and spread rapidly to provincial towns. People gathered in them for hours, playing chess and backgammon, listening to storytellers and musicians, and talking about everything from theology to the price of grain to what the Grand Vizier was reportedly doing behind closed doors. The religious establishment grew concerned. Some argued that coffee was an intoxicant and therefore forbidden under Islamic law. Others disagreed. The debate was serious enough that it reached the level of formal legal opinion, and eventually coffee was deemed permissible, though the coffeehouses themselves remained politically suspect throughout the empire's history, largely because they were places where men gathered without the structure of mosque or market, and unstructured gathering has always made governments nervous. The hammam, the bathhouse, was the other great institution of Ottoman social life and operated across every level of society. Every neighbourhood of any size had one. They were used for hygiene, obviously, but also for socialising, for business conversations, for celebrating births and preparing brides before weddings, and for the general business of community life that did not fit neatly into the mosque or the market. Hammams were segregated by gender, with separate facilities or separate hours for men and women. They were among the most democratic spaces in Ottoman urban life inside. The kaftan stayed at the door, and a wealthy merchant and a modestly employed craftsman occupied the same steam room. The great architectural expression of Ottoman social organization was the Külliye, the mosque complex. A proper Külliye built by a sultan or senior official was not simply a place of worship, it was a miniature welfare state. Around the central mosque clustered a school, a hospital or clinic, a soup kitchen that fed the poor daily, a caravanserai for travellers, a market whose rents funded the complex's operations, and often a hammam. The soup kitchens of major Istanbul Külliye fed hundreds or thousands of people every day, students, the poor, travellers, and staff. The complex paid for itself through its commercial properties and was administered as a charitable foundation, a vakuf, that was legally protected and could outlast the political changes happening around it. The supreme architect of these complexes was Mimar Sinan, who served as chief Ottoman architect from the 1530s until his death in 1588 at what was reportedly close to 100 years of age. Sinan designed somewhere between 300 and 400 structures during his career: mosques, bridges, schools, caravanserais, hands, and palaces, of which the Suleymaniye Mosque complex in Istanbul and the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne are generally considered his greatest works. The Selimiye in particular, completed in 1575, features a dome that Sinan himself claimed exceeded the Hagia Sophia in diameter, and the claim is close enough to accurate to be worth making. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most productive architects in human history, and the Ottoman landscape he shaped is still visible across Turkey, the Balkans, and the Arab world today. Rural life was quieter and more constrained than the urban world, as it always is. Peasant farmers worked land held under the Timur system, paying a portion of their harvest as tax to the Sipahi cavalry officer who held the grant. They were not serfs, they could not be bought and sold, and they had legal recourse in Ottoman courts, but they were tied to their productive obligations in ways that limited their mobility and options. The empire depended on them, fed itself with their labour, and governed them at enough distance that for many rural communities, the Ottoman state was primarily experienced as a tax collector who arrived once or twice a year and otherwise left them to their own affairs. It was, in sum, a world of extraordinary diversity held together by a framework that was simultaneously sophisticated and unequal, cosmopolitan and hierarchical, a civilization that produced remarkable art, architecture, and law while resting on the labour of millions of people who would never see the inside of Topkapi Palace, and never needed to, as long as the harvest came in and the tax collector was not too aggressive about the accounting. When the palace ate itself, Suleiman's death in 1566 set off a transformation so gradual that no single person watching it happen could have identified the precise moment. Things began to go wrong. It was not a crisis. It was an erosion, the kind that takes decades to become visible, and by the time it is visible has already done most of its damage. His son Selim II was not a disaster as sultans went, but he was also not Suleiman, and the gap between those two things was significant. Selim was not particularly interested in military campaigns, and was content to leave the actual governance of the empire to his Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, who was genuinely capable and ran things with considerable competence throughout Selim's 8-year reign. The arrangement worked. In a narrow functional sense, the empire continued to operate. Revenues came in. The army remained paid. But it established a pattern that would prove difficult to reverse. A sultan who delegated real power to others while occupying the throne as a symbol rather than an actor. Selim died in 1574, reportedly having slipped on a wet floor in his hammam after a period of heavy drinking, a detail that his nickname, the Sot, does little to contextualize charitably. His son Murad III reigned for 21 years and produced 49 children, which was remarkable by any standard of productivity, and somewhat less remarkable as an administrative achievement. Murad was increasingly influenced by the women of the imperial harem, his mother Nurbanu Sultan, and later, his favorite consort Safiye Sultan, who used their proximity to the Sultan to shape appointments, foreign policy, and the flow of information reaching the imperial ear. They were not acting irrationally. In a court where physical access to the Sultan was the primary currency of power, the women who had that access were doing precisely what any rational political actor in their position would do. This period, stretching roughly from the 1570s through to the mid-17th century, is sometimes called the Sultanate of Women, a label that has attracted debate among historians who point out that it frames female political participation as inherently aberrant. What it actually represented was a power vacuum in the sultanic office that various actors rushed to fill. The women of the harem were simply the most effectively positioned among those actors. After Nurbanu came Safiye. After Safiye came the extraordinary Kusem Sultan, who served as regent for two of her sons, Murad IV and Ibrahim I, and wielded political influence across roughly 4 decades, making her arguably the most powerful individual in the empire during much of the early 17th century. She was eventually strangled in 1651 by servants loyal to Turhan Sultan, the mother of the new young Sultan Mehmed IV, in a palace confrontation that demonstrated with some clarity how high the stakes of court politics had become. The structural problem running beneath all of this was the Kaif's the cage. Ahmed I, who came to power in 1603 at age 13 and died at 27, made a decision that seemed humane at the time and turned out to be deeply consequential. He ended the Ottoman practice of executing all princes upon a new sultan's accession. Fratricide had been brutal, but produced rulers who had at least survived a competitive environment. In its place, Ahmed established the system of confining princes in a gilded set of apartments within the Topkapi Palace complex, attended by concubines and servants, isolated from governance, administration, military affairs, and the outside world in general. The theory was that confined princes could not organize rebellions. The practice was that confined princes emerged from years, sometimes decades of isolation with no preparation whatsoever for ruling one of the world's most complex states. The Ottoman throne, under this arrangement, was regularly occupied by men who had spent their formative years in a few rooms, had never commanded troops, managed a province, heard a legal case, or conducted a diplomatic negotiation. The empire's bureaucracy was robust enough to continue functioning beneath them, which is a genuine tribute to the institutional structures built by the earlier sultans. But the sultanic office itself was hollowed out in ways that compounded with every passing generation. The Janissaries sensed this hollowing and moved accordingly. The corps that Murad I had created as the Sultan's personal, unconditionally loyal soldiers had, over the course of the 16th and early 17th centuries, transformed into something quite different. They had been allowed to marry originally forbidden and to pass their status to their sons. The Devshirme system, which had replenished their ranks with rigorously selected and trained recruits from Christian communities, was used less and less frequently. By the early 17th century, the Janissaries were less a professional military elite than a hereditary guild with weapons and a collective memory of what they used to be. Their military effectiveness declined. Their political confidence did not. In 1622, they crossed a line that had not previously been crossed. The young Sultan Osman II, 18 years old, energetic and possessed of ideas about military reform that the Janissaries found threatening to their institutional interests, was deposed, imprisoned, and killed by his own soldiers. He was the first Ottoman Sultan to be murdered by the Janissary corps, and the precedent it set was not a comfortable one for any sultan who followed him. The message delivered that day was unambiguous: reform us at your peril. Murad IV came to the throne in 1623 at the age of 11, and spent his first several years as a figurehead while others managed the empire around him. When he grew old enough to assert himself, he did so with a ferocity that his predecessors had conspicuously lacked. He executed officials who displeased him, personally supervised punishments, and launched a campaign against social behaviors he considered contributing to Ottoman moral and military decline. He banned coffee. He banned tobacco. He banned alcohol. He enforced these prohibitions with a seriousness that surprised people who had assumed they were declarations of intent rather than operational policy. He reportedly walked the streets of Istanbul in disguise to identify violators, and the penalties for being identified were not administrative fines. The coffee ban was particularly striking given how deeply the coffee house had embedded itself in Ottoman daily life by this point, and one suspects the empire's collective caffeine headache during this period was considerable. Murad was also, beneath the brutality, a capable military commander. He reconquered Baghdad from the Safavids in 1638 after a campaign of genuine operational skill, and the Treaty of Zuhab that followed established a border between the Ottoman and Safavid empires that remained essentially stable for the rest of the empire's history. He died in 1640 at 37, reportedly from cirrhosis of the liver, a somewhat ironic end for a man who had executed people for drinking wine. His brother Ibrahim, who succeeded him, had spent the entirety of Murad's reign in the cafes. He was 24 years old, had never governed anything, and had, according to several contemporary accounts, been genuinely uncertain whether he was being released from confinement or brought out to be executed. His reign of 8 years was erratic in ways that suggested a man whose grip on reality had been loosened by years of isolation. He developed elaborate fixations, dismissed competent officials on impulse, and made decisions that senior administrators spent considerable energy managing around. He was eventually deposed by a coalition of Janissaries, ulema, and palace officials in 1648, and executed shortly after the second sultan killed in the 17th century, following the precedent of Osman II. Beyond the palace, the countryside was restless. The Salali revolts, a series of peasant and bandit uprisings in Anatolia that ran intermittently from the late 16th century through the first decades of the 17th, reflected the pressures building below the elite level. The Timur system was degrading as cavalry sipahi found their land grants eaten away by inflation or transferred to tax farmers who were more interested in extracting short-term revenue than in maintaining stable agricultural conditions. Peasants displaced by conflict and economic disruption moved toward the cities or turned to brigandage. The provincial administration that had functioned reasonably smoothly under the great sultans was showing cracks. None of this meant the empire was finished. It was still vast, still largely functional, and still capable of significant military operations. But the distance between what it had been under Suleiman and what it was becoming under his successors was widening in ways that would eventually prove impossible to ignore. The walls of Vienna and what they meant. Before the catastrophe of 1683, there was a revival brief, genuine, and ultimately insufficient. It began in 1656 when an elderly Albanian statesman named Köprülü Mehmed Pasha was appointed Grand Vizier at the age of roughly 70, under conditions that he himself set as terms for accepting the position. He demanded complete authority over appointments, complete freedom from interference by palace factions, and the Sultan's guarantee that he would not be removed based on the complaints of others. The Sultan Mehmed IV, who was 14 years old and effectively managed by his mother Turhan Sultan, agreed. The empire, at that point, was in a poor enough condition that accepting an elderly man's conditions seemed the pragmatic choice. Köprülü Mehmed proved worth the concessions. He executed thousands of officials, military officers, and administrators he considered incompetent or corrupt. He stabilized the currency. He restored discipline in the Janissary corps with a directness that previous Grand Viziers had been too politically cautious to attempt. He suppressed a Venetian naval blockade that had been strangling Ottoman maritime commerce. He then died in 1661, having governed the empire with an efficiency it had not seen in decades, and was succeeded by his son Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, who continued the same approach with perhaps slightly less brutality and rather more strategic patience. The younger Köprülü's greatest achievement was Crete. The Ottomans had been fighting Venice for control of the island since 1645, a siege of the capital Candia that had stretched across 24 years in one of the most prolonged military operations of the breaks. Century. Fazıl Ahmed completed it in 1669, taking the last Venetian strongholds and adding Crete to the empire. He also conducted successful campaigns in Poland, acquiring the province of Podolia in 1672. The Köprülü era demonstrated that the empire still had the institutional capacity for large-scale, sustained military operations when competent leadership was applied to the problem. Fazıl Ahmed died in 1676. His successor as Grand Vizier was his brother-in-law Kara Mustafa Pasha, who inherited the momentum of the Köprülü reforms and the confidence they had generated, and who then made a decision of such magnitude and managed it so poorly that it undid much of what the previous 2 decades had accomplished. The plan to march on Vienna in 1683 was not inherently unreasonable as a strategic ambition. The empire had reached Vienna once before, in 1529, and been turned back by logistics rather than military defeat. The Habsburgs were the Ottomans' principal European rivals, and a decisive blow against Vienna would have reshaped the balance of power across the continent. Kara Mustafa assembled a force that contemporary estimates placed anywhere between 90,000 and 200,000 men. The precise number is uncertain, but by any measure it was an enormous army, and marched it across the Balkans in the spring and early summer of 1683. Vienna itself was defended by a garrison of roughly 15,000 soldiers under Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, supplemented by the city's civilian defenders. The Habsburg Emperor Leopold I had left the city as the Ottoman army approached a decision that was diplomatically embarrassing for him and strategically irrelevant to the siege. Starhemberg organized the defense with methodical competence, keeping the garrison active and the fortifications repaired through the summer months while messengers rode desperately westward and northward seeking relief. Kara Mustafa began the siege on the 14th of July, 1683. What followed over the next 2 months has been analysed by military historians at considerable length, and the consensus tends to settle on a single central error. Kara Mustafa chose to prosecute the siege through mining operations and gradual attrition rather than ordering a direct assault. The Ottoman sappers dug tunnels beneath the city's bastions and detonated explosive charges in an attempt to collapse the defences, while the main army sat in its camps. A direct assault on the weakened walls was ordered several times and then called off or half-heartedly executed. The reason most commonly offered by contemporary Ottoman sources, and it has a quality that makes it difficult to dismiss, is that Kara Mustafa wanted the city intact. A city taken by storm would be sacked by the soldiers who took it, which was standard military practice. A city that surrendered or fell through siege would be available for the Grand Vizier to claim as his personal prize, its wealth intact and under his control, rather than scattered among 100,000 soldiers. Whether this is entirely accurate or somewhat embellished by enemies of Kara Mustafa writing after the fact, the behaviour it describes is consistent with what actually happened at Vienna's walls across those summer weeks. The relief force assembled during July and August under the command of Jan Sobieski, the King of Poland, alongside forces from the Holy Roman Empire and German principalities. On the 12th of September, 1683, this combined army positioned itself on the Kahlenberg Ridge overlooking the Vienna plain. What followed has become one of the more celebrated engagements in European military memory. The Polish cavalry, the winged hussars, armoured lancers with distinctive feathered frames mounted on their backs, led a charge down from the heights that broke the Ottoman lines with a force and speed that the tired, extended Ottoman army could not absorb. Kara Mustafa's forces collapsed, retreating southward and eastward in disorder, leaving behind their entire camp with its supplies, equipment, and treasury. Kara Mustafa survived the battle. He reorganized his shattered forces at Belgrade and attempted to manage the damage done to his reputation through correspondence and recrimination. It was not sufficient. On the 25th of December, 1683, a date the records note with an almost theatrical irony, a delegation arrived from Istanbul bearing a silk cord from the Sultan. The Ottoman method of execution for high officials was strangulation rather than beheading. The silk cord considered a dignified distinction from common methods. Kara Mustafa received his, performed his ablutions, said his prayers, and met his end in Belgrade. What followed the defeat at Vienna was not a single sudden collapse, but a sustained, grinding retreat across almost 2 decades. The Holy League, an alliance of Austria, Poland, Venice, and later Russia, organized under the encouragement of Pope Innocent XI, pressed the Ottoman Empire on multiple fronts simultaneously. The great Habsburg commander Eugene of Savoy conducted a series of campaigns that dismantled Ottoman defensive positions in Hungary and the Balkans with systematic efficiency. The Battle of Mohacs in 1687 fought near the same ground where the Ottomans had shattered the Kingdom of Hungary in 1526, now produced the opposite result. The empire was losing territory it had held for a century and a half. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 was the formal accounting. Hungary, Transylvania, most of Slavonia, and Podolia were surrendered. It was the first time in the empire's history that it had negotiated significant territorial concessions to Christian powers in a peace settlement. The psychological weight of this was considerable. The Ottoman self-understanding had been built on expansion, the Ghazi tradition of pushing the frontier of the Muslim world outward, the assumption that the arc of history bent toward Ottoman success. Karlowitz introduced a different possibility, one that the empire's political class spent the following 2 centuries trying to process and address. The empire was not dying in 1699. It remained enormous, wealthy in its core territories, and administratively functional. It would continue to exist for more than 2 further centuries and conduct successful military operations in various theatres, but it had turned a corner that could not be unturned. The empire was now, for the first time, a state that had to think about defence rather than simply expansion, a fundamentally different posture that required different institutions, different strategies, and a different understanding of what the Ottoman state was for. None of the solutions arrived easily. The problems that had been accumulating since Suleiman's death, the institutional decay, the Janissary question, the provincial administration, the fiscal pressures could no longer be addressed from a position of strength. They would have to be confronted by an empire that was simultaneously losing ground abroad and struggling with its own identity at home. The next century would be defined by the gap between the speed of those problems and the speed of the responses to them. Tulips, reforms, and the world changing too fast. The empire that emerged from the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 was bruised but functional, and it retained enough military capacity to produce at least one more surprise. In 1711, Peter the Great of Russia, who had been steadily building his own empire eastward and was now pushing southward toward Ottoman territory, led a Russian army into Moldavia, expecting local support that largely failed to materialize. The Ottomans encircled him on the Pruth River with a force he could not match. Peter was trapped, his options exhausted, and by most reasonable assessments finished. He negotiated. The resulting treaty returned Azov to the Ottomans and produced a settlement that was, by the standards of the period, a genuine Ottoman diplomatic victory, one of very few in this era. Peter went home, absorbed the setback, and redirected his energy elsewhere. The Ottomans celebrated. It was a good moment, and good moments in this period of Ottoman history were worth noting carefully because they were not abundant. The Treaty of Passarowitz in 1718 closed another round of Habsburg-Ottoman warfare with further territorial losses. Serbia, northern Bosnia, and the Banat of Temesvar passed to Austrian control, though the Ottomans recouped some losses from Venice in Greece. The cumulative map of what the empire had surrendered since Suleiman's death was growing uncomfortable to contemplate. But the immediate aftermath of Passarowitz brought something unexpected, a pause. A genuine stretch of relative peace, during which the ruling class of Istanbul discovered that it rather enjoyed not being perpetually at war, and began spending its energy and resources on other things. The Grand Vizier of this period was Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, son-in-law of Sultan Ahmed III, and he had a sensibility that was unusual in Ottoman political history. He was curious about Europe. He had studied it at a distance, read the reports of Ottoman ambassadors who had travelled to Paris and Vienna and returned with detailed observations of European courts, gardens, architecture, and cultural life. He was interested in what the Europeans were doing and why they seemed to be doing it increasingly well. The era he presided over from 1718 to 1730 became known as the Lale Devri, the Tulip era, named for the flower that became the obsessive emblem of Ottoman elite culture during those years. Tulips, it is worth mentioning, were originally Anatolian and Central Asian flowers that the Ottomans had been cultivating for centuries. They had been exported to the Netherlands in the 16th century, where they triggered the famous tulip mania, arguably history's first documented speculative financial bubble before the Dutch market collapsed spectacularly in 1637. Now, roughly a century later, the Ottoman elite was importing the European enthusiasm for tulip cultivation back into Istanbul as though encountering it fresh, throwing lavish garden parties by candlelight with tortoises carrying candles on their backs wandering between the flower beds. The tulip had made a complete round trip from Anatolia to Amsterdam to financial disaster and back to Anatolia again, arriving the second time as a symbol of cosmopolitan sophistication. The flower itself was presumably indifferent to all of this. The more consequential development of the tulip era was the Ottoman printing press. The diplomat and intellectual Ibrahim Mutaferrika established the first press authorized to print books in Turkish and Arabic in 1727, nearly 280 years after Gutenberg's press had begun transforming European intellectual life. Jewish communities in Istanbul had been operating printing presses since the 1490s, producing books in Hebrew and Ladino for their own communities, a detail that the Ottoman state appears to have noted and then set aside for approximately 2.5 centuries before deciding the technology might be worth exploring for Turkish-language texts as well. The religious establishment had long resisted printing on grounds that the hand-copying of sacred texts was preferable to mechanical reproduction, and that concern had not entirely evaporated, which is why the early press was restricted from printing religious materials and focused on history, geography, and military subjects. Still, it existed, and the books it produced began, slowly, to circulate. The ambassador Yirmisekiz Mehmed Celebi had travelled to France in 1720 to 1721 and returned with a detailed report on French court life, architecture, administrative practices, and military organisation. His observations were read with genuine interest by Ahmed III and Ibrahim Pasha, and some of what he described began filtering into Ottoman practice new palace designs with influences from Versailles, interest in French military techniques, the beginnings of a systematic engagement with European knowledge rather than a simple dismissal of it. None of this sat well with everyone. The Tulip era's cultural openness and its elite garden parties and its European-inflected fashions generated resentment in constituencies that saw it as a betrayal of Ottoman and Islamic identity and also, more practically, as an indulgence paid for by a treasury that had been strained by decades of warfare, while ordinary people in Istanbul faced rising prices and deteriorating conditions. In 1730, a janissary of Albanian origin named Petrona Halil organized a revolt that drew in artisans, street traders, and discontented military men, swept through Istanbul, and brought the Tulip era to an abrupt end. Ahmed III abdicated. Ibrahim Pasha was handed over to the rebels and killed. The Tulip Gardens were not physically destroyed, but the political atmosphere that had produced them evaporated within days. The deeper problem that the Tulip era had briefly illuminated and that the Patrona Halil rebellion had then obscured was the widening gap between Ottoman and European military and technological capacity. Europe in the early 18th century was in the middle of transformations that would reshape the entire world. The scientific revolution had restructured the relationship between observation and knowledge. The beginnings of industrialization were stirring in Britain. Military technology and tactics were evolving rapidly, driven by the near-constant warfare among European states. The Ottoman Empire was watching this from a distance and absorbing pieces of it. French military advisors, European-style fortifications, new artillery techniques without yet grasping that piecemeal adoption was not going to close a gap that was structural rather than technical. The Janissary problem was central to this. Every serious reformer understood that the military could not be modernized without addressing the core that had become its institutional core and its primary obstacle. The Janissaries were no longer the disciplined professional force of Suleiman's era. They were a hereditary guild with deep political influence, considerable economic interests in the cities where they were garrisoned, and a demonstrated willingness to remove any sultan or vizier who pushed reform too aggressively in their direction. The memory of Osman II was not abstract. It was a living precedent that informed every reformer's calculations about how far to push and when to stop. Several European military officers were brought in during the mid-18th century to assist with specific technical reforms. A French convert, known as Humbarachi Ahmed Pasha, reorganized Ottoman artillery practices. Baron de Tott, another French advisor, helped establish a new artillery school in the 1770s. These contributions were real but narrow. They improved particular capabilities without touching the underlying organizational structure that limited what those capabilities could accomplish. The empire kept losing wars to Austria, to Russia, most repeatedly to Russia, and the losses kept producing treaties that conceded more territory, more access, more leverage to the powers pressing against its borders. What the empire had not yet developed was a coherent answer to a question that was becoming more urgent with every decade. Not how to fix this part of the army or that administrative process, but what kind of state the Ottoman Empire needed to become in order to survive in a world that was moving faster than its institutions could comfortably follow. The sick man of Europe. The phrase arrived in 1853, courtesy of Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, who used it in conversation with the British ambassador. He called the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe, a patient whose death, the Tsar suggested, needed to be planned for carefully and collectively, so that the great powers could manage the inheritance without going to war over it. The Ottomans were still very much alive when he said it, and very much aware of what was being said. The phrase nonetheless stuck with a tenacity that suggested it had captured something real, and within a generation it had travelled from diplomatic dispatch to common description. What made it sting was not that it was malicious, though the Tsar was not speaking from concern for Ottoman welfare, but that it was difficult to argue with. The empire in the middle of the 19th century was an entity of extraordinary territorial extent and very genuine fiscal and military fragility, surrounded by powers that were industrializing at a pace it could not match, and harbouring ambitions toward its territory that required very little concealment. Russia wanted access to warm water ports and influence over the Bosphorus. Britain wanted to keep Russia away from the Bosphorus. Austria wanted stability in the Balkans. France wanted commercial access and cultural influence. None of them wanted the Ottoman Empire to thrive. Exactly, they wanted it to weaken in directions that happened to be convenient for each of them. This was the Eastern Question, as European diplomats called it, and it dominated the international politics of the century. Every Ottoman crisis became a European negotiation. Every war the empire fought became an opportunity for outside powers to extract concessions, adjust borders, and expand their own influence in the resulting settlement. The empire was still large enough to matter and already weak enough to be managed, which placed it in precisely the position that great powers found most useful dependent, indebted, and in constant need of support that came with conditions attached. The seeds of this situation had been planted in the century before. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 had been alarming, less for its military consequences. The French were eventually expelled than for what it demonstrated. A European army had moved through the heart of Ottoman territory without the empire being able to stop it with any speed or effectiveness. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821 and ended with Greek independence recognized in 1830, was the first successful nationalist dismemberment of Ottoman territory and a template that others would observe closely. The idea that subject peoples had a right to national self-determination, a notion the French Revolution had injected into the political atmosphere of the entire continent, was circulating through every minority community. In the empire, and the Ottomans had no ideological framework prepared to counter it. The destruction of the Janissaries in 1826 was, in its own way, the most consequential single event of the early 19th century for the empire's internal history. Sultan Mahmud II had spent years preparing the ground for this moment, quietly building a new European-style military force alongside the existing corps. When the Janissaries rose against his reforms in June of that year, Mahmud was ready. He raised the Prophet's banner, called the population of Istanbul against the rebels, and destroyed the corps with artillery fire and subsequent mass execution. The event was given the deliberately ironic official title of the auspicious incident. The Janissaries, who had made and unmade sultans for 2 centuries, were eliminated in a matter of days. Their barracks were burned. Their organization was dissolved. Mahmud proceeded to build the modernized military he had envisioned, along with new schools, new administrative structures, and a gradually expanding relationship with European technical expertise. What followed under Mahmud and his successors was the Tanzimat, the reorganization and reform program of genuine ambition and deeply uneven results. The Gulhain Edict of 1839, issued in the early months of the reign of Mahmud's son Abdulmesid I, promised something that would have been unimaginable to Suleiman's lawyers: equality before the law for all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion. Muslims, Christians and Jews were to have the same legal standing, the same protections and the same obligations. New courts applying new civil and commercial codes based on European models were established. New schools were opened on European pedagogical patterns, a postal system, a telegraph network, new roads. The empire was, visibly and deliberately, remaking itself. The problem was that the Tanzimat reforms were simultaneously too much and not enough, too disruptive of traditional arrangements to be accepted without resistance, and not deep enough in their implementation to actually solve the structural problems driving the empire's decline. The new courts coexisted uneasily with the old religious courts. The new schools sat alongside the old Madres system without replacing it. The new commercial codes applied in cities and barely penetrated rural areas. And the political will behind the reforms was always in tension with the conservative religious establishment, with provincial elites who benefited from the old arrangements, and with a general population that had not been consulted about the direction of change being announced in their name. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 introduced another dimension of the problem. The Ottoman Empire, allied with Britain and France against Russian expansion, won the war in a military sense. Russia was pushed back, the treaty was favourable, and the empire's territorial integrity was nominally guaranteed. But the financial cost of the war had been ruinous, and the Ottomans had borrowed heavily from European banks to sustain the campaign. The debt did not go away when the war ended. It accumulated. More loans followed, at terms that became progressively less favourable as European creditors assessed the empire's actual ability to repay. By 1875, the empire could no longer service its debts, and declared bankruptcy. In 1881, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was established, a body run by European creditors that took direct control of significant portions of Ottoman revenue to service the outstanding obligations. The empire had not only lost territory, it had lost financial sovereignty, handing control of its customs revenues and various excise taxes to a foreign-managed institution whose staff eventually outnumbered the employees of the Ottoman Finance Ministry itself. The nationalist uprisings, meanwhile, continued. The Bulgarian uprising of 1876 was suppressed with a severity that produced international outrage. British Prime Minister Gladstone published a pamphlet condemning what he called the Bulgarian horrors, to considerable public effect. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 resulted in another devastating military defeat, and the Treaty of San Stefano that followed proposed a map of the Balkans so favourable to Russia and so damaging to Ottoman interests that the other European powers intervened to revise it at the Congress of Berlin. The revised treaty was somewhat less catastrophic, but still produced the independence of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, autonomous status for Bulgaria, and the cession of Bosnia-Herzegovina to Austrian administration. The empire's European presence was being dismantled piece by piece. Into this atmosphere came the Ottoman Constitution of 1876, the work primarily of a reformer named Midhat Pasha, who had long argued that representative government was the only framework that could hold the empire's diverse population together under a shared political identity. The constitution was real. It established a parliament with elected representatives from across the empire's communities, limited the sultan's absolute authority, and guaranteed civil liberties in language that would not have been out of place in a contemporary European document. It lasted 93 days. The new sultan, Abdul Hamid II, used a clause in the constitution itself that allowed him to suspend parliament in times of war, a provision perhaps not intended to be used quite so quickly or permanently, and ruled as an autocrat for the next 30 years. Abdul Hamid was not without intelligence or political instinct. He invested in the telegraph network, which he used both for communication and for surveillance. He built the Hejaz Railway, connecting Istanbul to Mecca. He promoted a pan-Islamic identity as a political counterweight to the nationalist movements fragmenting his empire. But he also ran a state built on informers, censorship, and the suspension of the very reforms his predecessors had announced, which meant that the modernizing forces that the Tanzimat had set in motion continued to build pressure beneath the surface of his autocracy. The explosion came in 1908, when a movement of young military officers and intellectuals, the Committee of Union and Progress, known in Europe as the Young Turks, forced the restoration of the constitution. Abdul Hamid briefly tried to reverse the situation and was deposed in 1909, replaced by his brother Mehmed V. The empire had, once again, changed direction. Whether the new direction would be fast enough to matter was the question that the next decade would answer. The empire's last gamble. The Young Turks, who restored the constitution in 1908, inherited an empire that was already in serious trouble, and then watched it get considerably worse before they had a chance to implement any of the changes they had promised. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 arrived before any meaningful reform program could take hold, and they were catastrophic. A coalition of Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro states that had themselves been carved from Ottoman territory within living memory attacked simultaneously in October of 1912 and advanced with a speed that stunned military observers across Europe. Within weeks, the Ottomans had lost nearly all of their remaining European territory. Edirne Adrianople, the city Murad I had made his capital over 5 centuries earlier, fell to Bulgarian forces. The empire that had once stretched to the walls of Vienna was reduced to a small strip of European land around Istanbul itself. A second Balkan War the following year, in which the victorious coalition turned on itself over the division of territory, allowed the Ottomans to recover Edirne. It was a limited consolation. The psychological impact of the Balkan Wars on the Committee of Union and Progress, the organization that now effectively governed the empire, was profound and in some ways poisonous. The defeats accelerated a shift in the committee's ideology from a relatively inclusive Ottomanism, which had hoped to bind all the empire's communities into a shared political identity, toward a harder Turkish nationalism that saw the empire's future in terms of a Turkish core rather than a diverse community of equal subjects. This shift would have consequences that outlasted the empire itself. The three men who came to dominate this period, Enver Pasha as war minister, Talat Pasha as interior minister, and Cemal Pasha holding authority over the navy and Syria, were the architects of the decisions that determined the empire's final years. Of the three, Enver was the most ambitious, the most ideologically driven, and the most willing to take risks of the kind that could not be recovered from if they failed. He admired German military organization, had trained with the German army, and believed that an alliance with Germany offered the empire its best chance of reversing its losses and building toward a pan-Turkic empire reaching eastward into Central Asia. The secret alliance with Germany was signed on the 2nd of August, 1914, 2 days before Germany declared war on France. Two German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, were in the Mediterranean when the war began, pursued by British naval forces. They were permitted to enter Ottoman waters and were formally transferred to the Ottoman navy, their German crews remaining aboard under Ottoman flags with new Turkish names assigned to the vessels. In late October 1914, this fleet bombarded Russian ports on the Black Sea. The Ottomans had not formally declared war. They had simply fired on Russia, and the result was the same. The logic of entering the war was, from a certain perspective, not entirely irrational. Britain, France, and Russia, the powers on the other side, had all spent decades chipping away at Ottoman territory or demanding concessions. There was little reason to believe that an Entente victory would treat the Ottoman Empire generously. Germany, at least, was offering something: military support, equipment, training, and the possibility of recovering lost territory if the Central Powers won. It was a gamble, but the empire's leadership had concluded that standing aside would simply mean losing more slowly. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 was the one major bright spot in the empire's wartime military record. Britain and France launched an assault on the Dardanelles Strait in February and landed troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula in April, aiming to take Istanbul, knock the Ottomans out of the war, and open a supply route to Russia. The defense of Gallipoli was ferocious and, ultimately, successful. A relatively unknown lieutenant colonel named Mustafa Kemal commanded the forces at a critical sector of the front and held his position against repeated assaults, reportedly telling his troops that he was not ordering them to attack, but ordering them to die, that the time they bought with their lives would allow reinforcements to arrive. The Allied forces, having suffered enormous casualties on both sides, withdrew in January 1916. It was one of the most significant Allied failures of the entire war, and it produced a genuine Ottoman military hero in Mustafa Kemal. The other fronts were far less successful. Enver Pasha personally led a winter offensive against Russia in the Caucasus in 1914 to 1915, advancing through mountain terrain in temperatures far below freezing without adequate supplies or preparation. The campaign at Sarıkamış was a disaster of a scope that is difficult to fully convey of the roughly 90,000 Ottoman soldiers who began the operation. The vast majority were lost to combat, frostbite, starvation, and disease. It was one of the worst military catastrophes in Ottoman history, and it was the direct result of Enver's refusal to listen to the officers who told him the operation was impossible in those conditions. It was in the aftermath of this Caucasus disaster, in the spring of 1915, that the Committee of Union and Progress authorized the deportation of the Armenian population of Anatolia. The Armenians were a Christian minority who had lived in eastern Anatolia for millennia and the CUP leadership, which had already been moving toward an exclusionary Turkish nationalism, accused the community as a whole of disloyalty and potential collaboration with Russia during the Caucasus campaign. In April of 1915, the deportation orders went out. Armenian men were taken first, typically killed in groups away from the villages. Women, children, and the elderly were marched southward into the Syrian desert in columns that stretched for miles, with inadequate food, water, or shelter, subject to violence from soldiers and irregular forces along the route. The death toll from the killings, the marches, and the conditions of the desert camps is estimated by most historians at somewhere between 800,000 and 1.5 million people. It was a systematic, organized destruction of a community, and it was ordered and supervised by the Ottoman state. The surviving Armenian population was dispersed into diaspora communities that now exist across the world. The question of how to name and classify these events remains a subject of international political dispute, though the historical evidence of mass atrocity is not seriously contested by scholars. On the Arab front, the British encouraged the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali, to lead an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule in 1916, offering promises of Arab independence that would prove, in the end, considerably more generous than British post-war intentions. The revolt, assisted by British officers including the figure who became known as Lawrence of Arabia, tied down Ottoman forces in the Hejaz and undermined Ottoman claims to leadership of the Islamic world. Baghdad fell to British forces in 1917. Jerusalem fell in December of the same year. By 1918, the empire's military position in the Arab provinces had collapsed entirely. The end came in the autumn of 1918. British General Edmund Allenby's forces broke through Ottoman lines in Palestine in September with an operational elegance that the exhausted and demoralized Ottoman armies could not respond to. The front simply dissolved. The Armistice of Mudros, signed on the 30th of October 1918, ended Ottoman participation in the war. The terms were severe. Allied forces would have the right to occupy strategic points. The army would demobilize. The Bosphorus would be open to Allied ships. Within weeks, Allied warships were anchored in Istanbul harbour. Enver, Talat, and Semel, having brought the empire into the war, presided over its military disasters and authorized the destruction of the Armenian community, fled Istanbul in the early hours of the 3rd of November, 1918, aboard a German submarine. They slipped out of the city they had governed while it was still dark. All three would be assassinated within a few years by Armenian avengers operating across Europe and Central Asia in what became known as Operation Nemesis, organized by the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. None of them lived to see 1923. The empire they left behind was occupied, bankrupt, and on the verge of formal dismemberment. The Treaty of Sèvres, negotiated in 1920, proposed to partition Anatolia itself among Greece, Armenia, France, and Italy, leaving a small Turkish rump state in the interior. It was the final accounting 6 centuries of empire reduced to a negotiating text that divided the heartland among the victors. Signing it seemed, to many Ottomans, like the last act of a very long story. But the story had one more chapter, and it was already beginning, in a city called Samsun, where an officer who had defended Gallipoli had just arrived by boat. The Long Shadow. Mustafa Kemal stepped off a boat in the Black Sea port of Samsun on the 19th of May, 1919, officially dispatched by the Ottoman government in Istanbul to oversee the demobilization of remaining forces in Anatolia. What he actually intended to do there was considerably different, and the Ottoman government in Istanbul operating under Allied occupation, its sultan increasingly compliant with foreign demands, would realize this too late to stop it. The immediate trigger for what followed was the Greek landing at Smyrna, Izmir, on the 15th of May, 1919, 4 days before Kemal's arrival at Samsun. Greek forces had been authorized by the Allied powers to occupy the city and its surrounding region, with the understanding that a peace settlement would formalize the transfer of territory. The landing was accompanied by violence against the Turkish population, and news of it spread through Anatolia with a speed and fury that the Ottoman government in Istanbul, preoccupied with its own political survival, was not equipped to manage. Kemal understood and began organizing the response from the interior. What became the Turkish War of Independence was not a single movement from the beginning, but a coalition of resistance forces, regional congresses, and irregular militias that Kemal gradually unified under a central command. He established a Grand National Assembly in Ankara in April of 1920, deliberately placing his government in the Anatolian interior, away from the occupied capital and its compromised institutions. The assembly declared itself the legitimate government of Turkey and set about the practical work of fighting a war on multiple fronts simultaneously: French forces in the south, Armenian forces in the east, and Greek forces advancing from the western coast all represented threats that had to be addressed with an army that was being assembled from scratch out of whatever soldiers, weapons, and supplies could be gathered from a country exhausted by a decade of continuous warfare. The turning point came at the Battle of Sakarya in the summer of 1921, a grinding 3-week engagement along the Sakarya River west of Ankara, where Kemal, commanding personally, stopped the Greek advance and began pushing it back. The Great Offensive of August 1922 completed the reversal. Greek forces collapsed across a front that had seemed stable and were driven back to the Aegean coast in a matter of weeks. The burning of Smyrna in September 1922, in which large parts of the city were destroyed and tens of thousands of people died or were displaced, remains one of the most contested and painful episodes of the entire period, its causes and responsibilities still debated. What followed was an armistice, a population exchange of catastrophic scale, roughly 1.25 million Greeks from Anatolia, exchanged with roughly 400,000 Muslims from Greece, uprooting communities that had existed in those places for centuries, and eventually the Treaty of Lausanne in July 1923, which recognized Turkish sovereignty over Anatolia and replaced the punishing terms of the earlier Treaty of Sèvres. On the 1st of November 1922, the Grand National Assembly abolished the Sultanate. Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman Sultan, left Istanbul on the 18th of November aboard a British warship, carrying whatever personal belongings he could take with him. He would die in exile in San Remo in 1926. The Caliphate was abolished in March of 1924, its holder sent into exile as well. The Ottoman Empire, in every institutional and political sense, was finished. The Republic of Turkey was proclaimed on the 29th of October, 1923, with Mustafa Kemal as its first president. What followed under Kemal, who would receive the surname Atatürk, meaning Father of the Turks, under the surname law of 1934, was a transformation of Turkish society so comprehensive and rapid that it remains difficult to fully categorize. The legal system was replaced wholesale with a new civil code based on Swiss law. The fez, which had itself been introduced by Mahmud II in 1829 as a modernizing replacement for the turban, was banned and replaced with Western-style brimmed hats, completing a cycle in which a hat introduced to signal modernity had become, within a single century, a symbol of backwardness requiring replacement by yet another hat. Religious courts were abolished. Sufi orders were closed. The Islamic calendar gave way to the Gregorian calendar. The alphabet reform of 1928 was perhaps the most striking act of the entire program. Atatürk decreed that Turkey would abandon the Arabic script it had used for centuries and adopt a modified Latin alphabet. He gave the country roughly 3 months to complete the transition, after which the old script would no longer be used in official contexts. He then travelled across Turkey personally, setting up a blackboard in village squares and town halls to teach the new letters to farmers, shopkeepers, soldiers, and officials. The president of a republic of roughly 13 million people, giving spelling lessons, The literacy campaign that accompanied the reform was genuine and produced measurable results, though the break it created with the written Ottoman past all of that history, literature, and administrative record, suddenly inaccessible to anyone who had not specifically learned to read the old script, was a loss that Turkish scholars are still working to address. Women received the right to vote in local elections in 1930 and in national elections in 1934, ahead of France, ahead of Italy, ahead of several other European nations that considered themselves considerably more advanced. Atatürk died in 1938 at 57 from cirrhosis. He had spent roughly 15 years remaking a country from the wreckage of an empire, and the Turkey he left behind was recognizably the state that exists today, with all the complications and unresolved tensions that inheritance involves. The Ottoman legacy, however, did not end in 1923. It dispersed. The borders drawn from the collapse of the empire shaped by the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France, by the various peace settlements, by the decisions of powers who knew the territory primarily from maps, produced the political geography of the modern Middle East. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine. These borders, imposed on populations with their own complex identities and loyalties, have generated conflicts that were not resolved in the 20th century and remain unresolved in the 21st. The question of what the Ottoman framework held together and what was released when it ended is not an abstract historical exercise. It is a description of the world as it currently exists. In the Balkans, communities that spent centuries navigating Ottoman authority carry that experience in their languages, their food, their architecture, their legal traditions, and in some cases their unresolved grievances. In Istanbul, the mosques of Mimar Sinan still anchor the skyline. The Grand Bazaar still operates. The Topkapi Palace receives visitors from across the world. The food that spread across 3 continents under Ottoman influenced the coffee, the baklava, the various forms of grilled meat, the yogurt-based dishes. The rice preparations is now simply the food of a very large part of the world, its origins largely forgotten by the people eating it. The empire that began with a small tribe on a frontier in northwestern Anatolia in the late 1200s lasted until the second decade of the 20th century. It governed at various points some of the most important territories, cities, and trade routes in the world. It produced extraordinary architecture, sophisticated law, and a model of multi-community governance that was imperfect but real. It also produced violence, exploitation, forced displacement, and atrocities that its successors have not always been willing to fully reckon with. It was, like most human institutions of comparable scale and duration, a mixture capable of both remarkable achievement and genuine cruelty, shaped by the people who led it and the conditions they navigated, leaving a mark on the world that has not faded and will not fade. The tribe that camped in the hills near Sogut 700 years ago could not have imagined any of it, and yet here we are. And so the story of the Ottoman Empire reaches its quiet end not with a single dramatic moment, but with a gradual dissolving into the world it had shaped. 600 years is a long time for anything to last. Longer than most of us can properly imagine. The empire is gone now, but its outline remains pressed into the earth of 3 continents, in the shape of borders, the walls of mosques, the routes of old roads, and the recipes that nobody remembers learning. You have travelled a very long way tonight, from a cold frontier camp in the hills of Anatolia to a republic still finding its footing in a changed world. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting for you on the screen. Go ahead and take a look. And if tonight's journey was one you enjoyed, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a thought in the comments below. For now, let your shoulders settle, let your breathing slow, and let the rest of the world wait until morning. Good night. Sweet dreams.